Hi, everybody. I'm sure you're having a great conference. I loved conferences when I was in nursing. I loved all the different topics and just wanted to learn everything. So I'm really honored to be included in the spring BCTVA conference. You have clicked on Guides Through Grief, helping veterinary technologists support their clients through the loss of a pet. So settle in, get a cup of tea. I'm going to be doing some storytelling and information sharing. Some of what I say you may already know, and some may be new. Normalizing grief is my aim. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the land I live on. I live in Courtenay, BC, on the eastern shores of Vancouver Island, the unceded territory of the Comox First Nations. My name is Andrea Townsend. I am a trained death doula, which I studied after 16 years working as a critical care RN. I worked in aircraft, in the Yukon, ICUs, in emergency rooms, remote outposts throughout BC, and clinic and outreach internationally in Haiti. I felt called to work in death care, to create safe spaces to talk and wonder about death and dying. I've had the privilege of caring for the dying and their families to the moment of death and beyond. And navigating grief at end of life is part of the work. This is one of my greatest teachers pictured here, my dog, Jackson. She died around 3 years ago at 9.5, and her palliation and death was one of the most profound experience I've had with grief and loss. Even after years of nursing, I truly became grief literate after her death. So what are we going to talk about? An overview. We're going to hear a story of Jackson, a story of grief and love and praise. We're going to discuss grief literacy, early, disenfranchised, and anticipatory grief, and go through those definitions, what entering the ceremonial space of grief is and means, what prolonged grief disorder is, elements to support your client's grief, ritual and legacy work, children's grief and loss, and elements to support yourself as caregiver. Wow. This is my dog, and this is a video. I hope it's working for you. To hear a story of one's grief is to hear a story of one's love. It's just playing for me now. Technology. My greatest teacher in grief and loss was not a human. She was my dog, my golden retriever, a feisty female I named Jackson. Our adventures took us into the mountains of BC, the Yukon, and Alaska. She has had close encounters and communications with a gray whale in Skagway and orcas here on the island. She was a willful dog, as the dog trainer informed me when she went through puppy training twice. She was smart, too smart sometimes, but she was ruled by her stomach, so that was helpful and trying at times. As a puppy, she ate all the legs of my IKEA dining table. That's when I found out she liked wasabi. She went through 4 pairs of sunglasses, only the expensive ones, a dress, an entire frozen pizza, a Ziploc bag full of protein powder that came out the other end completely intact. She filled my life, and my life formed around her needs. Jackson became the lens through which I viewed my life. I had survived a childhood of neglect And this impacted how I connected to myself and others. I never learned to ask myself what my needs were at any given point. But through Jackson, I was learning to care for myself. She anchored me to the earth. She was the only constant in my life. She brought me back into my body after facing trauma at work, and I knew every inch of that dog's body. The tip of her tail was crooked, and her bottom teeth were too. She received my love, and she gave hers unconditionally. And after some time, we moved to the island. And since there were no rentals that would take dogs, I bought a house. So yeah, I bought my dog a house and me by proxy. Eventually, I brought a human baby into the house. Now, Jackson wasn't super stoked about this change, to be honest. And to be honest, I was more adept to caring for my dog than my own daughter, as I had more practice with Jackson, but we figured it out. And we spent a couple magical years in this golden age some women experience who have delayed having kids and instead had a dog. I had an old dog and a new baby. Life moves forward, whether we wish it to or not, and time shifted when I took Jackson to the vet clinic for a hematoma in her floppy ear. A lump was found, not a lipoma this time, but lymphoma. And she was started on prednisone and given months, maybe a year to live. I didn't see the tsunami of symptoms coming from Jackson and I. She didn't take well to the prednisone, and the routine of my family changed to me spending most of my time caring for my dog, who was uncomfortable, always thirsty, always hungry, always needed to be let out to pee, let back in, let out, 24 hours a day sometimes. You know, she would have good days and bad days. And I was watching myself care for her from outside my body. I was crushed by grief. And she wasn't even dead yet. On what was her last day, we walked her along the pier where I was shamed for my fat dog, which I appreciate the concern, but she had started to retain water. We brought her home and she wouldn't eat her dinner. Now, this fact should have sent alarm bells, but I ignored it. My grief clouding my judgment. So finally, I called the clinic. It was a Saturday, 6:30. Our vet happened to be on call, and she was surprised that Jackson had taken a turn for the worse so soon. And it was surreal that life was continuing around us as we drove to the clinic, as I was feeling my earth shattering. The time in the clinic was a blur of deciding what to do with her body after euthanasia. And she wasn't dead yet. My grief filled the room. When she was taking her last breath, I told her what a good girl she was and how much I loved her. And that it was okay to go. And I just kept petting her head. And my family, including my 2.5-year-old, watched me love and grieve and praise this dog. I held Jackson until she was gone. And that was my last gift to her, to be with her until her last breath, to honor our time together by facing her death together. A chance for the whole family to say goodbye. And then I entered grief, and I'm still in it because my love for that dog has not ended, just our time together. So that was our final gifts to Jackson, walking her to the end. And then A warm-hearted break. To take a deep breath while revisiting loss-filled stories is a way to release grief. In traditional Chinese medicine, the lungs are associated with grief and can carry any unexpressed grief. That's why it's nice to take a deep breath after telling and hearing stories of grief and loss. So, what is grief? The Center for Prolonged Grief has the definition of a natural response to a meaningful loss. Elements can include a preoccupation with the deceased, intense yearning, strong emotions, isolation, withdrawal. Grief is permanent when we lose someone we are deeply attached to. We grieve because we are hardwired for attachment. This is biologically how we're made. I attached emotionally to Jackson, where previously I didn't allow myself or was unable to form secure attachments to the humans in my life. She regulated my nervous system. That's what our attachments to our people and animals do. Our relationships regulate our physiological and psychological ecosystems. And why her loss was and is deeply impactful for me. I lost that fur-covered safety net for my dysregulated nervous system. Grief is tricky to navigate because it's not linear. It doesn't follow Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief that were originally stages for a patient-focused death adjustment pattern, not for the families of the dying, though emotions of anger, depression, bargaining, acceptance can and do occur. Grief is disorganized, it's chaotic, it's disruptive and confusing. It's complex. It's more than an emotion. It's a ceremonial space that you never leave. After Jackson died, I also felt relief. I wasn't a caregiver anymore. I could rest. I didn't have to be constantly ready to attend to her. I felt guilt while feeling relief. I was a person who was experiencing deep grief, and I didn't really feel like I could talk about it. And I'm a death doula. And that was my introduction into disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief is when your grieving doesn't fit in with society's attitude about dealing with death and loss. I'm going to read this quote. If I had lost a human partner, there would have been the usual funeral rituals, and being an emotional basket case would have seemed understandable. But our culture treats the death of a pet more like the loss of an automobile. When it wears out, just go buy another one. Well-meaning friends and family members had advised this in their attempts to help me feel better. What they didn't get was that I had lost a soulmate, an irreplaceable relationship, not a piece of property. To integrate grief, one has to express it in community. It is designed that way. The lack of support can prolong the emotional pain. You, as vet techs, may be the only understanding human the client can really talk to about their grieving experience, especially those clients coming in over and over with a palliative pet. But the form of grief I feel you see the most is anticipatory grief. I'm just going to read this quote. Grief expressed out loud for someone we have lost or a country or a home we have lost is in itself the greatest praise we could ever give them. Grief is praise because it is the natural way love honors what it misses. And that's by Martine Pretel. So, anticipatory grief is the grief of the eventual loss of a loved one. I believe that bittersweet feeling can start the moment you fall in love with a pet. Due to the nature of their short lives, we are likely going to outlive our pets. And that painful reality of, I have you, I love you, and I know you won't be here forever is a natural part of our human experience. Clients with palliative pets know this all too well. As you know, palliative care is not a diagnosis, it's an approach to care. It's a care plan to ensure quality of life, even in the midst of a life-limiting illness, like cancer. During my experience, it was helpful for me to have conversations with you, vet techs and veterinarians, about what quality of life means for Jackson and I. I feel the fear in caring for a palliative pet is that you are lengthening their suffering, that we as the family member is lengthening their suffering. That fear can be addressed when an honest conversation is had about end of life goals. Goals like to manage and decrease pain and suffering. A great resource I came across is provided by journeyspet.com. This website is created by two veterinarians in Wisconsin who specialize in death hospice and end-of-life care. They developed a tool, a quality of life scale, to help humans assess their pet in areas like pain, mobility, respiratory distress, to make an ambiguous, difficult decision clearer. So the human knows they are doing everything to ease the suffering. I know I struggled. My grief made decision-making very challenging. If I had had that assessment tool, it would have helped me clarify those goals of care more. The experience of a traumatic loss or an unexpected death of a pet, the pain comes all at once. One moment they had a pet, the next moment they don't. I saw this in emergency rooms with humans throughout my career. The shock and disbelief people experience can affect their grief and the integration of their grief. As a nurse, I have brought family members into the room while CPR was being performed on their loved one. It helps them to understand what is happening during such a great emotional upheaval. I'm not sure if this happens in the animal world, but from my experience, giving people a choice to experience as much as they want is helpful. They can always say no. Traumatic deaths are complicated deaths. They are a risk factor in prolonged grief. So, prolonged grief disorder is a new mental illness added to the latest diagnostic and statistical manual or for mental disorders, or DSM for short. This recent development is controversial in the death care realm, as it looks like it pathologizes a natural human experience. But what is outlined is that complications can arise during the experience of grief that prolongs intense feelings of grief past an acceptable time frame and negatively impacts the human's functioning in the world. So risk factors include the traumatic loss of a pet, maybe guilt of euthanasia, wondering if there was anything else they could have done, demographics as risk factors of the human, poor socioeconomic status, being a part of a marginalized population, trauma story or trauma history, and poor support systems. Interventions, recognizing the risk factors of the human, creating awareness of the unique circumstances the human brings, and making meaning from grief. Entering the ceremonial space of grief. How to grieve in a death-denying culture and turning misery into mystery. It's making meaning from the profound loss one is experiencing. It is an isolating world when entering the experience of caring for a dying loved one. Navigating the challenges of grief in a death-denying culture is difficult. Death in our medical culture is seen as failure. This patient failed treatment. The language we use is one of failure. A person has reached the point, or an animal, in their care that now the priority is quality of life, not cure. I've seen long deaths in the ICU when treatment after treatment is attempted and failure with each one. Their end is met in a room with me, with beeping monitors in the room of a hospital. Death is hidden away in hospitals in our culture. We don't talk about, and we definitely don't celebrate it, generally, unlike other cultures in the world. This leaves people lost in grief with no guides. Tara Brach, author of Radical Acceptance, describes the Lakota Sioux tradition of considering a person who is grieving as being the most holy. There is a sense that when someone is struck by the lightning of loss, they stand on the threshold of the spirit world. The prayers of those who grieve are considered especially strong and are given food and places of honor in which to grieve. They believe that mystery, as in the universe, is peering through the eyes of the griever, and to be in their presence is to be closer to the mystery of life. How would it look and or feel like to be supported and honored during grief? So how can you, as guides through grief, support your client who has entered this ceremonial space of grief for their dying pet? By providing a safe space to explore and talk about death and dying at any stage of the pet's life. What is a good death? The root meaning of euthanasia from Greek literally translates to good death or easy death. Eu meaning well or good, thanatos meaning death. You are taught to provide a good death to the animals in your care. So how can you provide the sense of a good death for the humans present? Communication is foundational. Bereaved means to be robbed. When a client is in front of you facing a profound loss and is in grief, trauma-informed care holds them with the understanding that there may be other factors playing out. This pet may be more than a pet. It may be the only living being that provides them unconditional love. This couldn't have become more evident than during the shutdown of the pandemic. Pardon me. The isolation we as humans felt had never been experienced like that. I'm just gonna get rid of this for a sec. Sorry, guys. So the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. Realize grief can look like many different emotions. Anger, indifference, sadness. I truly feel reception in the vet clinic gets the full exposure to the range of a person's grief response, especially when payments due. Recognizing a trauma history is extremely prevalent in our population. So we can gain compassion by changing our thinking from what is wrong with this individual to what happened to this individual, especially if they decide on a treatment that you don't agree with, like leaving their pet to be euthanized alone. Responding from this place gives you kind, firm boundaries. They are looking to you to find emotional safety, whether they know it or not. And this is their most valuable time and vulnerable time. Awareness of this playing out helps you to resist re-traumatization. The person is losing their pet. The person that is losing their pet is looking for guidance and options. Having choice and feeling like they have all the information at hand empowers people, empowers them. Ensuring to themselves they are doing everything they can for the comfort of their pet. Then, that after the pet is gone, they know they did everything they could. And that bad news is shared with dignity in a private setting with respect. In the hospital, hey, we're all busy. Get it. Generally, it's thought if you don't have time to be seated when sharing bad news, you don't have time to share it. So vet technologists and veterinarians as funeral directors, you are responsible in assisting the humans in the funeral arrangements of their pet. Things I wished I was told when I received the first diagnosis. I actually wish I had been given a package of resources. Since Jackson's prognosis was less than a year, having had some resources to look over in my home about quality of life and symptom management and end of life planning would have been useful. I couldn't take in all the information given to me at the time of receiving Jackson's diagnosis. I also would have appreciated knowing if euthanasia being provided in the home was an option for us. If it isn't an option you provide in the clinic, is there another practitioner you can refer them to? What are the options at your clinic that a pet owner may not be aware of? I discovered while preparing for this talk, there is a crematorium for pets here where I live. And where I could have taken Jackson myself and had a bit more ceremonial time with her. I didn't know this was an option. I don't know if I would have chosen it at the time, as I'm not sure I've had the strength to bring her body home, but I felt sad that I wasn't given the option because maybe I would have. I want to just point out the picture in the corner of that golden retriever in her home death funeral there, her home funeral. This is off a grieving site, a pet loss grieving site. And I think it just demonstrates so beautifully what options look like for people at home to do their own ceremony, their own funeral, and their own rituals. So my options were given to me just before the moment of euthanasia. The gift you give to the client by having that difficult conversation of end-of-life planning for a pet early is time. And if they didn't get it the first time, it might be helpful just to repeat it again, because maybe you did tell them right away some resources and they forgot. We're all just doing the best we can. I get it. It's time. So time to consider their loss and what they want to do. What is available to them in their area? What's legal to do in terms of body disposition? So they are not making that decision at the time of death for their pet with an ongoing illness. Obviously, traumatic loss is another scenario but taking the time to cover all the options, even taking that pet home, if it's appropriate, helps the client integrate their grief down the road. Giving people time to make arrangements in the event of a death may give them the feeling their pet had a good death because there was a plan in place. Death isn't losing a loved one, it's gaining their absence. You still have a relationship with your being after they die. It is your love for them that continues, and that love will never die. So how can you encourage keeping that love, that relationship going after death? Ritual and legacy. We love our animals, and generally we want to remember them, even though it's painful because we're reminded they aren't around. Encouraging clients to cultivate a practice of legacy work with a palliative pet is immensely helpful. Pet death doulas can be very useful in this capacity. Have a look online. There may be one in your area. You never know. Giving them, the clients, ideas on how to keep the memory alive may help alleviate the anticipatory grief they are experiencing, and will support the integration of grief after their pet has died. We received a paw print in the mail, and I loved it. I didn't realize that was going to happen. I realize now that I could have done a clay paw print if I had taken her home after euthanasia and then taken her to the crematorium as a family. As it is, she lives in her urn on our mantle, and I haven't spread her ashes yet. I'm not ready. With those clients with palliative pets, encouraging them to take video may be helpful. I know I had a sense as she was getting older that I needed to take more video instead of just pictures. And we love watching those videos now. Encourage your clients to include their kids in this legacy project. Make t-shirts, mugs. You can see my daughter here with her memorial hoodie. It has a picture of her and Jackson, and it gives her an opportunity to talk about Jackson with her classmates. It's a relationship that continues, and it's a love that gets to be expressed publicly. Making ritual moments to include their pet's memory may be helpful. When we go for walks in the forest, we pet the moss and we say, "Hi, Jackson." We shake her collar to hear the familiar sounds of the tinkling, and it just brings us comfort. Encouraging them to share their experience on a public pet memorial page may also be helpful. There are a few on Facebook. I did it on my own social accounts, and I post on her death anniversary. It's just a lovely way to make a tribute to the being that you loved and to continue to love. And it allows you to experience that being again. And you remember them and the impact that they had on your life. So, turning misery into mystery with children's grief. How would you respond to the question, should my child be present at the death of our pet? And for me, I would answer, well, it depends on your child. That child is experiencing a loss. So did they have a strong connection to the pet? It might be beneficial for them to be there, so they can also integrate their grief. This slide from the Children's Grief Foundation of Canada describes children's grief like a puddle. One moment they're having intense, strong, overwhelming feelings of grief. The next moment they're hungry and just asking for food. They can jump into the puddle of grief and out quickly, but when they are in it, feel it as deeply as we do, as if being swept away in a river of grief. So including kids in end-of-life conversations can help them integrate their grief. Explaining what they might hear and see during euthanasia will prepare them. Acknowledging their feelings and holding space to hear them grieve, and supporting their parents in having resources for their children. Maybe you have books you can lend out, or just some resources. Some physical signs of children in grief, just like us: problem sleeping, change in appetite, mood swings, everything adults feel. They can also have regressive behavior. Maybe they were potty trained and then they had to go back to diapers. That's a normal thing that can happen. You normalizing what kids may go through during grief is tremendously helpful for the parents. And those are pictures of my daughter, Jackson. Okay, so now, do you know the best thing you can do to help your clients through grief? By continuing to show up for work in a healthy way. So assisting the grieving with compassion requires you to be present in your true self, your authentic self. And this requires you to know what groundedness feels like in the body and what crossing of boundaries feels like in your body. Boundaries. Having a clear sense of your own grief and working to integrate your own grief allows clear boundaries to exist between you and the griever. Burnout and fatigue occur when you take on the emotional labor of a griever or someone in pain. Acknowledging the emotional resources innate in the human before you honors their experience and gives them a boundaried container in which to start their grieving journey. For example, if you cry harder than the client during the death of a pet, this is information for you that you have grief to tend to. This is not something to be ashamed of, but an opportunity to hold self-compassion in your own journey as a human, ever evolving. Having done your own grief work prevents these emotional and energetic entanglements with the humans that you're helping. Taking on others' emotional labor is tiring. Being an empathetic and sensitive person and being sensitive to others' emotions, it's a gift, and it is something to manage to protect your nervous system. It's your nervous system that takes the beating with porous boundaries in caregiving professions. Closing the loop of a stress response. What if you are impacted by the grief of others? In the moment, having the awareness that you're having a nervous system activation may give you some room to gain perspective. For example, if you're feeling anxious, impatient, judgmental, you're becoming entangled. Sarah Kerr, a death doula here on the island, beautifully articulates this subtle transaction. She says, navigating the role of the helper and the client is a constant negotiation of how much energy to give to assist and how little energy to give, knowing your clients have their own innate emotional resources. Closing the loop of a stress response may look like noticing your activation, taking a small step back, Moving your awareness to your body just reminds yourself that this moment you're in that's intense will end. And you need to respond to your nervous system. Taking a break, taking a breath, taking a walk, these actions tell your body the stress or the intensity is over. And to stop releasing stress hormones that are designed to save you in times of danger, but ultimately harm you and lead to a dysregulated nervous system if this is your everyday working experience. So in conclusion, being a guide through grief requires you to look at your own grief and integrate your grief first. The more integrated you are, the less encumbered you are, and you are then more able to meet the griever in an authentic, effective way and sustain your own practice for years to come. Veterinary technology is a calling. Not everyone can navigate the love and loss of assisting humans with their beloved pets. So thank you for spending your precious time with me to consider death and dying, especially when it comes to our pets, shows us how sacred and valuable our time is here on Earth. Jackson was and continues to be one of my greatest loves. And I'm so honored and grateful for the short time that we spent together. So I just want to read this quote before we go. Grief is the love that has to find a place to go. Now that the person we're grieving is no longer here, my grief and the grief so many people are experiencing in the world right now cuts as deep as it does because the love is as profound as it is. So thank you for the work that you do in looking after our fur babies and looking after us with our fur babies, and enjoy the rest of your conference. You can take a picture of this for resources. And